Hello and welcome to the Leadership Matters podcast, the podcast for people passionate about leadership and organisational performance, offering up insight and inspiration from peers who have great experience to share from developing leaders in some of the world's leading organisations. I'm your host, Andy Dent of the Oxford Group, and here at the Oxford Group we've had the privilege of developing leaders at organisations across the globe for over 35 years. We fundamentally believe that leadership matters. As leaders, what we choose to focus on and how we show up on a day-to-day basis really does shape organisations and the people experience. So if you're interested in learning more about leadership development, then this is definitely the podcast for you. As it's our first season, we'd love you to subscribe or hit like today to fuel us on the journey to more episodes. So without further ado, let's dive into today's episode. So welcome everyone to the Leadership Matters podcast. And I'm absolutely delighted to have Dr. Martyn Newman, a psychologist and international expert in the field of emotional intelligence, the co-founder of RocheMartin and author Capitalists, the ultimate guide to developing emotional intelligence for leaders with us today. So welcome, Martyn. Thanks for being with us today.
It's a great pleasure, Andy. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Fab, and thanks. And just to kind of frame how we were connected and our organisations became connected, probably about 5, maybe 6 years ago now, the Oxford Group were looking for a tool that really helped leaders to gain a better understanding of their emotional intelligence. And that led us by recommendation to RocheMartin, who I know you co-founded, and you'll tell us the story, I'm sure, as we get into it. But we've been using your tools, as you know, in our programs for the last 5 years, and they've been a real game changer for many leaders to kind of build a stronger self-awareness and a set of tools to help them really motor forward in the engagement of their people. So anyway, I'm sure you'll share all of the backdrop to that in a second, but I'm really interested to kick the podcast off with where your burning passion for, I guess, leadership and people development came from.
Wow, that's a great springboard, I think. I've always had a real concern about human rights from when I was quite young. Actually, it has a lot to do with my family, and so I have a background both in human rights and psychology, and I've had the opportunity really of working in some of the world's hotspots before I got really involved in the corporate world. There was one particular experience that had a profound impact on me many years ago when I was sent down to Nicaragua, a small Central American country that had been involved in something of a civil war. And I remember the first night we arrived in Managua, the capital. We were woken at 5 o'clock in the morning by automatic weapons going off in the street, and we really knew that we were in a war zone. Later that day, though, we traveled to a fairly remote village that had seen a lot of the fighting, and the villagers had gathered to hear these gringos from the north ask their questions. And so I started speaking through a translator. And not long after I started speaking, a young boy stood up and asked me a question. He said, can you ask the doctor to come and see my mum because she's not very well? And the translator explained, look, he's not that sort of doctor, son, if you know what I mean. And so I continued on. And a few minutes later, he interrupted again. And this time the translator didn't bother translating and instead told the boy to sit down. So I stopped. I said, no, look, I'm really interested in his question. What is it? And the young guy said with a confused sort of tone, well, what kind of a doctor is he if he can't help anyone? And you imagine the blood drain from the translator's face, and he apologized for interrupting my train of thought. But he had no idea, that guy, how often the boy's question was going to interrupt my train of thought as a psychologist for the rest of my career. Because, it's an interesting discipline, psychology. We spent the best part of 100 years being able to define and describe human misery, really. What's wrong with people? We've got taxonomic systems for categorizing it. And I got to thinking then, I wonder what would happen if we were able to define the components of human potential, of nobility. What would be the emotional strengths that would enable people to step up to some of life's big challenges? What if we could measure these skills that empower people to release their talent? And strangely, when I started my work in the corporate world, I found similar themes where modern theories of management also seem to rest on this very negative paradigm that was familiar to me in psychology. The modern manager seemed to exist to prevent dysfunction or limit deviance or correct error, rather than really understanding how to foster talent. And so I got to thinking way back then, wouldn't it be great if we were able to break open these building blocks and demonstrate to leaders how they were able to draw out the talent of their people. And what I love about psychology is I think that we're able to help people think really practically about the future. And I'm convinced that as leaders in organizations, that's our job too, to draw people's attention to the future, to draw out their talent and help focus it on how they can respond to those challenges. And I've always been very excited by that challenge.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating story, and I know there's even more of a fascinating story in terms of the journey that you've traveled to get to where you are now. So I think it would be great for our listeners just to unpack the journey that you've been on personally and where that's led you to now, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. So before working corporately and working in human rights, I spent 10 years as a senior academic in psychology departments in universities in Australia and the UK, essentially teaching personality assessment and as a clinical supervisor. I guess I was always fascinated by the huge potential that's released when you begin to help people measure their behavior. Once you can operationalize it, once you can make it concrete for people and you can benchmark it against an international standard, it gives people back control of their own development, I think. And then when you can provide the tactics to help people change their behavior, it becomes really exciting. And so back then we developed some pioneering assessment techniques to help people achieve much more powerfully and more quickly change in their lives than what traditional approaches were able to do. And so we actually opened a pro bono clinic in Melbourne, Australia, and applied these approaches to very vulnerable people, not only to help them stay out of hospital, but to go on to thrive, build effective relationships and exciting careers. And it was at that time, around the year 2000, the millennium, when Glaxo welcomed SmithKline Beecham, began that merger, and it was the biggest merger in history at the time. And so I was parachuted into the middle of that because they'd spent a lot of money on securing IP. They had the commercials worked out, but they hadn't spent much attention on their investment in people. The relationships between people, how they felt, their fears, their anxieties, their reluctance to share their IP, to collaborate, what I call emotional capital. So I started working with the heads of R&D and applied these same principles that we've been using in the clinic, but to these very bright people to help them understand themselves better, broker positive relationships with their colleagues, and foster greater collaboration and teamwork. And, looking back, it was a huge success. And I think that was a catalyst for us, because after that, we were invited by, ExxonMobil and Boeing Aerospace and Singtel Asia Pacific to come and apply these same leadership development methodologies. And we've been doing that now for the last 20 odd years.
Fabulous. And I guess just jumping into some of those experiences, what would you say have been one of the highlights of the last 20 years of RocheMartin?
Well, I think for me, I spent the last 7 years working at Sky, and back then Jeremy Darroch invited us in because as the CEO of the largest media outfit in Europe, and he was struggling at the time to attract and retain talent, to innovate quickly enough to take on Netflix and Apple, keep up with Amazon and so on. And to his credit, Jeremy was convinced that if people had the emotional and social skills to bring their best selves to work, and that you had a culture that supported that, then the commercials ultimately would take care of themselves. And I agreed with him. So we launched a program based on equipping people with the emotional and social skills that they needed to be at their best. Now, it was a difficult environment. These people largely were, very bright, very cynical. They moved very quickly and initially didn't really have time to focus on this. We called the program Better Self as a play on Sky's byline, Believe in Better. And the program ran for 6 years and actually generated 20 quarters of straight growth and led, not that long ago to an acquisition by Comcast for $40 billion. And I was out for breakfast with the chief operating officer not that long ago. And he told me, he said, you know what, we got that result because we paid attention to our culture and built it on the emotional, social competencies of emotional intelligence. And you can quote me on that. So I've been quoting him ever since.
Fabulous. Great story. And it just reiterates the power and the foundation that emotional intelligence allows, great things to happen in many different ways. So thank you so much for that. I want to get into some of sharing some of your insight and expertise in terms of what you would think is a really powerful approach or the development activities that would inspire leaders to think differently, to change their behavior or shift their performance. What are your kind of 2 or 3 go-tos? You've obviously seen a lot of leadership and development programs over the years, I'm sure, but what are the things that stick out to you or methods that you've used to really shift things for leaders?
Yeah, great question, Andy. Look, what we know, I think, about human behavior is it's really tough to change. And it gets even tougher when you get to midlife. And the reason for that is because the emotional experience we have as human beings actually become hardwired in our brains. Over the last 15 years, neuroscience really has pulled the curtain back and showed us that it's emotions in the brain that shape our thought and therefore our decision making. And particularly when people are under a lot of pressure and stress, like leaders often are, it's emotions that do the heavy lifting as to how they respond to the world and make decisions. So understanding them and how they work is the only real way you can achieve lasting and sustainable change. And this is because emotions form part of the stories we create about ourselves. So, for example, Andy, imagine that you were switched at birth and raised by a rich Texan oil family, or by contrast, a poor Kenyan shopkeeping family. Would you be different today? Well, of course you would. And that's because the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are powerfully influence the way we behave. And they shape the way we think and our attitudes and our behaviors and so on. So here's the absolutely key insight, I think, that should be at the core of any leadership program worth spending money on. If you're a coach or a training professional and you want to help someone reach their potential or change some difficult behaviors, the place to start is to help them change the story they have about themselves. And then secondly, change their understanding of how they respond to the world. And so, people are not likely to change these stories easily. That's the challenge. They will resist it. It's the reason why so many leadership development initiatives fail, because simply telling people to change through challenging them or worse, through coercion, doesn't work. So that's the reason we start every new engagement with a conversation and a psychological assessment using the tool you mentioned, the ECR, the Emotional Capital Report, because it's a key tool that helps people understand how their emotions are shaping their behavior, their stories, how their emotional skills are helping them achieve great things. Leaders strong in self-confidence and optimism, for example, engender confidence and positive morale. But if you're struggling with expressing genuine empathy, or you don't know how successful relationships work, you'll find it very difficult to connect on the emotional level with others, and you limit their ability to trust you and engage with you. So exploring these emotional competencies helps identify, I think, what really matters to people, what might be limiting them, and provides them with the building blocks of how to cultivate and develop new behaviors, how they can make new decisions and create new products and solve new problems. And this is why it's called emotional intelligence. And I think that's an absolutely key differentiator if you're going to help people, especially in midlife, attempt to change behavior.
So let's say that layer's established and we've got, a level of emotional intelligence work in there, or a tool like the emotional capital report. What other things have you seen in leadership development programs that help the magic happen? Whether it's a certain tool or a piece of kit or a particular activity that you've seen a leadership developer take a group of leaders through. What else have you seen that's out there?
Well, there's a plethora of activities that over the years people have used, as you know, you're experienced in this space, in order to try to help people understand their need for change. But if you really want the literature, if you want the science, then you've got to go to the counseling psychology literature, because over the years, it's that discipline that has really examined what elements of, say, therapy or counseling or whatever actually help change people's behavior. And it turns out that there are 7 key principles that fall out of the bottom of that literature that, when taken together, form the essential principles underlying the very best activities that help people change. And so, just as an example, the first one is engagement. It's pointless trying to push people through leadership development programs if they don't see what's in it for them, if there's a lack of emotional commitment to it. So the first challenge is create a compelling and engaging promise, one that's credible, one that's grounded in science, one that has the commercial imperatives up front and center, because that's what leaders are trying to achieve at the end of the day. And secondly, benchmark those skills. Where do I sit in reference to an international cohort of my peers, for example? So I can begin to sort of, when you go to the gym, you really want to you want to benchmark. You want to know where you start. And then, of course, there wouldn't be gyms if they didn't have mirrors all over the place. People want to look into a mirror and actually monitor change. And so we want to provide people with feedback, good high quality feedback about how they're making progress. They need to see the skills modeled so they can see how the behaviors actually work, and they begin then to implement them in their own experience. And you want to inoculate people against setback. It's easy to become demoralized, I think, and discouraged in leadership development programs because we're constantly distracted by other things. So you want to build in opportunities for people to meet together, share their experiences, and support one another, and so on. And the key element is measure change, measure everything that moves. So these 7 principles underpin and form the basis of all of the interventions that we supply to people in order to, once they take the emotional intelligence journey, virtually guarantee that we can see a measurable, demonstrable benefit over the course of time. And the thing about emotional intelligence, it's not something you can develop by attending an American motivational workshop. This is something that you can take your shoes and socks off and run across those hot coals all you like, but 3 months later, you're not going to be doing anything differently, because we know, and best research comes from University of College London, it tells us it takes about 60 days of consistent practice of applying these skills to grow the neurological networks necessary to sustain behavior change. So there's a great deal of science that helps us, I think, approach leadership development with a lot more rigor today, and we can expect tangible outcomes as a consequence.
Thank you. I literally could stay in this space for hours, but I won't, because we've got quite a few other questions to get into. But thanks for sharing that insight there. So it's a really interesting time for leaders at the moment, and I'd be really interested to pick up on what you think are the biggest challenges and the biggest opportunities that are facing leaders right now in corporate global organizations.
Wow, yeah, that's a huge question, isn't it, Andy? I mean, I think I've always believed that the primary task of a leader in any organization really is to direct people's attention, draw their attention to the things that really matter. And this has never been easy at the best of times, but in this moment it's a really serious challenge. We ongoing exposure to constant disruption and distraction, anxiety and uncertainty, over the past 2 or 3 years in particular, wear down the body's normal ability to adapt and adjust. And I think, leaders have got a massive challenge here in how they manage the attention flow and how they manage the emotional tone in their business. People we're working with at the moment are experiencing an enormous amount of emotional fatigue from the last few years. But interestingly, not that long ago, the World Economic Forum met to answer that very question, I think. And they met in Davos, as usual, to discuss a range of issues shaping the new world of work. And as you can imagine, the good and the great were there, and the extraordinarily rich as well. But they could never have anticipated really what was to come. AI, artificial intelligence, robots were, of course, at the top of the agenda, and so was the challenge of the environment and sustainability. And, of course, the challenge that organizations had to cope for the very first time with 5 different generations working in the organization with different expectations. But then Klaus Schwab, the godfather and founder of the Economic Forum, stood up as he's done to produce the Jobs of the Future report. So a hush fell, there's a lot of expectation. And he looked across the audience and he said, look, to deal with these challenges, a combination of talents, technical, digital, and commercial, will not be enough. And there was an almost audible "I told you so" from all the HR delegates there. And then he went on to say, leaders will have to match the reinvented nature of work, how to successfully manage people who are not sitting in the office, how to measure and reward them in virtual space, how to connect diverse skill sets and that lead to optimum results. And, again, then there was an almost audible "I told you so" from the tech giants. Zoom were there and Google were there, and they were fidgeting in their seats to give him a standing ovation, But then he drew breath, and to everyone's surprise, he said this. He said, we will all need very human qualities. What will be absolutely critical, he said, will be emotional intelligence. We need leaders who are emotionally intelligent. Now, this was the World Economic Forum, and while baby boomers like me were picking themselves up off the floor and, trying to find a fax machine, before Generation X and Y could refocus their Google glasses and get the message out on Instagram, Jack Ma from Alibaba, one of China's, massive companies, steps up and announces to gain success, a person will need high EQ. And in less than 10 minutes, emotional intelligence went from nowhere on the World Economic Forum agenda for the last 20 years to center stage as the must-have skill that leaders will need to succeed. And of course, the big disruption in the workplace this year is coming from the challenge of mental illness, which is having a massive impact on economic outcome. So, to summarize that, I think what we've witnessed, Andy, in our lifetime is this sort of huge shift away from an industrial age capitalism defined by self-interest and profit maximization towards what I call an era of emotional capitalism, which is really defined by a growing social and environmental and emotional consciousness, deeply held human values, and it's having a profound impact on business. And these are the realities that leaders have got to come to terms with, and the skills they need to address these are fundamentally emotional and social. That's the challenge, I think, for leaders today is to get to grips with that. I think the data is compelling. We know where these leadership insights have come from, and we know how to build them.
Thanks for sharing that story so vividly. I have images of fax machines and Google glasses going through my head. So thanks for bringing that one to life. So here's an interesting one for you. Let's say that you're going to be stuck on a desert island, and you can have one delivery from whomever, let's say an agnostic Alibaba or an Amazon or someone like that, going to drop one parcel off with 3 leadership books for you to read, or an independent bookseller maybe are going to send them over to you in a sustainable way. What would be those 3 leadership books?
What a great question. Look, everybody would expect me to say, Daniel Goleman's Emotional Intelligence, but really, I wouldn't. These days, emotional intelligence, is non-negotiable. It's really table stakes. If you want a seat at the leadership table at this moment in history, if you're not paying attention to these skills, if you're not building them in your leadership team, then you really are. You're really not where leadership is really really required today. These are fundamental. So for me, the most important book for leaders, I suppose, is The Leadership Challenge by Jim Kouzes and Barry Posner. It's been around for a while, but it just keeps getting better with each edition. Jim's a friend of mine, and we did an interview together a few years ago, and I just find him so insightful. The book made my list because Jim believes leadership is about ordinary people who get extraordinary things done, not only at work, but also in life. And, leaders bring out our skills. That's their job, our capacities, our values. And Jim and Posner suggest leadership is everyone's business. It's about self-development. And the challenge is really personal. What motivates you to be your best day in and day out? What skills do you need to rise above mediocrity, resist the gravitational pull of negativity and stress? It's in its 6th edition now. And the book describes these 5 leadership principles and 10 very practical actions that challenge us to become the best leaders we can. It's a kind of awaken the giant within, for quiet achievement. And I love it. But for deep insights and a wisdom that has stood the test of time, you really can't go past Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, I think. It's surprising to say that maybe, but Marcus Aurelius was a Roman emperor and world leader during his day. And, and among his powerful insights was the recognition how important it is to cultivate a peaceful state of mind. And I believe that to be true. I said that to the senior guys, to the people at Sky in one of my first meetings with them, that in the second half of life, the most important skill you're going to need is how to develop a peaceful mind. And hardly one of those people in the room are able to quiet their mind for more than a few seconds at a time. And this forms, I think, the bedrock, the foundation of how you cultivate emotional intelligence. So to do this, we need to stop worrying about things that are beyond our control to change, and instead focus on the things in our lives that represent our good fortune. He says things like, when you arise in the morning, think of what a precious privilege it is to be alive, to breathe, to think, to enjoy, to love. It's not an argument for resignation, but a recognition that the only things we can really control, our judgments, determine our state of mind and therefore our emotions. It's a kind of don't sweat the small stuff, an ancient version of that. Yeah. And then finally, the third book, I think, was a game changer when it was published, and that's back in 2010, 2011, Learned Optimism by Martyn Seligman, the former head of the American Psychological Association. For a book about optimism, though, it's ironic that it draws much of the evidence from studies on depression and helplessness. Seligman spent years clinically testing the idea that people learned to be helpless, and reviewing the research on depression, and found that the ability of some people to bounce back from setback is not due to some kind of triumph of the will or due to having some inborn greatness, but rather an emotional skill, the way people explained events to themselves, explanatory style. And he reminded us that optimism, rather than sort of whistling in the dark or looking on the bright side of life, is not so much about that, but it's about resilience. It's not a book about the endless possibilities of positive thinking. Seligman says success requires persistence, the ability to not give up in the face of failure, and it gives a really good scientific foundation for that, but as well as a blueprint for dealing with difficulties, I think, solving problems and recognizing opportunities.
Fantastic. A lovely choice there of 3. And just on I'm glad you chucked Meditations in, Marcus Aurelius. I don't know if you've come across The Daily Stoic by a guy called Ryan Holiday. And so I kind of I've been reading it for the last couple of years. It's basically a kind of a sentence, a phrase from each of the Stoics throughout the year, and there's different themes throughout the different seasons. And then Ryan Holiday does this kind of quite cool thing where he almost translates that into what does that mean for us now. And you just pick one a day, and it's one of those things that's just easy to get into the kind of habit cycle of. So just one to chuck in the mix there.
Yeah, I think you're right. I share your enthusiasm for Ryan Holiday's work. You know, the Stoics, I think, got a bad rap historically. Yeah. We see them as these sort of miserable people who, you know, resigned themselves to stay away from pleasure and happiness and so on. But they weren't at all. They were extraordinarily practical people and deeply insightful, recognizing the only things you can ultimately control are your own thoughts and judgments.
Yeah.
And how you spend your energies will determine over time, you know, the reality that you generate. And so focusing that attention and in a very efficient and skillful way is the way to arrive at your potential. And so I think you're right, Andy. I love it.
Yeah, completely. I mean, for me, just when you were talking about the experience of kind of quieting the mind and getting to peace, just having picked up Ryan Holiday's stuff, I just think, you know, so grounding, helps you to appreciate and just creates that inner calm, which, let's face it, we all kind of need a bit of that in today's fast-paced world. So thanks, Martyn. That was great insight there. So I guess in the multimedia world that we're in nowadays, we don't always consume development through books, do we? There's lots of other ways we can do it. So is there anything that you would recommend that you think that every leader should either listen to or watch? That might be a TED Talk or a podcast, or just something that you would chuck out there, something you think would be powerful.
It's hard to narrow that one down, isn't it? There's so much stuff out there and it's so good. But you know, I think back to, you know, when we first started working in this business with ExxonMobil, for example, one of our first big clients. These people were engineers. You know, they'd spent 35 years on gas pipelines and oil platforms, and we used to take them away for 6 days retreat to because the business couldn't afford to lose them. They had so much specific knowledge. And in the middle of the week, we'd always surprise them by showing them a film. And it was a film they'd all seen before, but probably hadn't thought about in the same way, because it's a film you see, but you don't actually critically reflect on it until, you know, later on, I think. And it's Dead Poets Society. Remember that film by Peter Weir? An incredible portrayal of leadership and the impact of individuals and communities. So it's set in conservative Welton Academy, and the film explores the transformative leadership style of English teacher John Keating, who is played by Robin Williams. It's one of his absolutely stunning roles, and Keating embodies this charismatic, you know, incredibly humorous, unconventional leader who challenges the status quo of this buttoned down private school and encourages his students to think critically, you know, to embrace their individuality, seize the opportunities presented to them. You know, we often hear people say carpe diem, seize the day. It was popularized really in that film. And from a leadership perspective, Keating demonstrates authentic leadership by being true to himself and his beliefs. He's unafraid to challenge the established norms of the school. He encourages students to do the same, to raise questions. And his authenticity really is what inspires trust and admiration and fosters a strong connection with his students. He's a visionary leader, really, and he instills this sense of purpose and passion in his students and encourages them to explore their own interests and pursue their own dreams. And, you know, for me, you know, that's what leadership is all about, really. It's not about imposing our vision on people or our will. It's about creating a space so that people can experience some degree of self-discovery and then be self-directed in their learning and growth. So he creates an environment that values independent thinking and fosters creativity and encourages the open dialogue. You know, helping these young people to develop their own voice. And I think that's a wonderful responsibility that leaders have. However, the film also highlights the challenges and risks associated with unconventional leadership. You know, Keating's methods actually clash with the conservative values upheld upheld by the school administration and some parents. And I think, that's the challenge of leading in today's model, is that if you're going to lead with any kind of creativity, you're going to come up against people who are anxious, people who are afraid, people who are deeply conservative. And it serves as a cautionary tale about the need for courage. The leaders need to be able to absorb that backlash and become the shock absorbers to protect their people when they challenge the status quo and disrupt established systems. But that ultimately, it's what Steve Jobs, is recognized for. It's what Anita Roddick from The Body Shop, all of these people we admire and respect, shook the system and said it can be done differently. And I think that's an element of leadership that's really important.
Yeah, some really good parallels there. Fascinating, thank you. And I guess a lot of your work has been to help people to understand what motivates them and keeps them, self-reliant and all that good stuff. What about you? What keeps you motivated and inspired?
Well, so many things, I suppose, but to sort of, in a one-liner, I suppose people who know me know that I love the works of Henry David Thoreau, the American author. He's just really insightful, and he said, look, what lies behind us and what lies before us are small matters compared to what lies within us. And when we bring that out into the open, miracles happen. And and I'm convinced that's the job of leadership. This is what we do, and we no longer have any excuses because we know what these behaviors look like. We know how to measure them. We know how to develop them. And in my work, I'm really fortunate because I get to work with people and see this happen, day in and day out. And it's genuinely inspiring to provide people with, both that insight and then some tactics and strategies, a blueprint, if you like, that they can follow. And they come back to you like the guys and the people at Sky did, and when they start telling you this has changed my relationship with my teenage kids, this has really changed my life, then the impact on their direct reports and the impact on the business and the performance of that business is going to be tangible and measurable. And I find that, gets me out of the door and to work every day. I just love that.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, I hear you. That's great work, and I can see how that really does keep you going. So what about if you were to forward gaze, say 5 years down the track, what do you think the skills, mindsets and behaviours are going to be the imperatives to leaders in the future?
Yeah, 5 years is a long time these days, isn't it? So quickly. And clearly the emergence of AI is raising all sorts of questions about how we face the future. And, it's already had some useful wins since John McCarthy coined the term way back in the 50s. But, it's helped improve our lives, directing our phone calls or helping us find efficient routes across the city and so on. But I think, too, it's got a lot of potential to diminish the human experience, making us more distracted than ever, a little bit more selfish and self-referenced. More predictable in some ways, as we're pushed information that corresponds to our choices, and so our world becomes really managed and contained by this system. We have a wealth of information, but really a poverty of attention. We don't know what to pay attention to anymore. The value of our physical connectedness is in a way being replaced by this hyper connectivity. And I think this is where the value of emotional intelligence shines. It's to preserve our essential humanity. Human beings are social to the core and need each other to create and innovate to maintain our well-being and mental health. And if you ask employees what skill they're going to need most in the next 5 or 10 years, and it's been done by people like Towers Watson and the Oxford Economics Research Firm, the answers are not greater business acumen or P&L management. The top priorities are relationship building, teaming, co-creativity, the ability to manage diverse employees, the skills of social interaction, and so on. And when I interviewed Jeremy Darrett from Sky at the EQ Summit a few years back, I asked him what he thought was the most important skill leaders need today to manage this. And he thought for a minute, and given that Jeremy's background is in accounting, he said it's empathy. The ability to pay attention to another human being and establish an authentic emotional connection. And I think that's right. I think nothing is going to be more important to making diversity and inclusion programs work. Nothing's going to be more important to convincing customers that you can listen and understand and make them feel important. Nothing's going to be more important to help you integrate multi-generational talent or to foster innovation and creativity in your business.
Yeah.
So empathy, I think, is the new master skill for the 21st century. I really do.
Yeah, no, I'm with you 100%. An absolute kind of superhero skill now and into the future. And the more we can master that, the better we will become, I think. So, okay, fantastic. So we're at that point where we've got the closing question now. So we've stolen this format or borrowed this format from another well-known podcast. And this is where we get one of our previous guests to leave a question for a future guest. So here is your question, Martyn. If you had a magic wand and could implant every leader of people with a specific skill or behavior, what would it be? I think we've just kind of had the answer in empathy there, but so I'm going to have to ask you to tell me if you could implant another skill or behavior, what would that be alongside empathy?
Yeah, so I think, just to answer that question, I preempted it, didn't I, in some ways? Because I do think it is so critical. But, it was Heinz Kohut, the European psychoanalyst, who said this. He said, in midlife, there are two things which motivate people. He said, you either want to be admired or you need to be understood. And I think if you get to midlife and you're still looking to be admired, you're in all sorts of trouble. It's probably what generates some of the more toxic behaviors that we come across in the workplace, some of the more disingenuine activities that we see from leaders who are desperately insecure or desperately in need of controlling others. But I think today the world is moving so quickly. Our organizational cultures are richer and increasingly diverse, both ethnically, but also in terms of generational talent, different people coming into the workplace with different motivations, different needs. Gone are the days when, engineers like ExxonMobil, people that I've worked with years ago, could go into a cubicle and shut the door and invent stuff. These people now have to be world class at the way they manage their relationships and engage people. So I think, empathy is absolutely the critical skill necessary. But alongside of that, I think is optimism. Because optimism is something that has a robust quality to it. It's certainly about positive mood and how we maintain positive mood in the face of the relentless negative gravitational pull of the environment we're confronted with all the time. You only have to watch the news for 5 minutes to feel that pull. It's a skill that also encourages us to look forward and look over the horizon and imagine the future, imagine what's possible. That's our job as parents with our kids as well. But then the third element of it is resilience, that ability to go back and back and back in the face of setback, because inevitably we face setback in life, and whether or not we get flattened or by those negative experiences, or whether or not we can rise to the occasion and focus on the tasks that need to be done to go back in the face of those disappointments, will determine whether or not we succeed. And, over 23 years in psychology, there's not a single piece of research that contradicts the idea that optimism is the single biggest predictor of how well people do in life. And the great news is we know now what the structure of it looks like. We know how to build it in our children. We know how to cultivate it in our colleagues, in our employees, and we know how to build it in ourselves to continue to sustain morale and generate the energies necessary, to drive our best performance and drive business forward. So I'd say it's empathy, but it's also the handmaiden of that is optimism.
So thanks, Martyn. Thanks for sharing everything you've shared today. It's been Absolutely fascinating. I've got loads of notes here, and I'm sure your insight will be extremely valuable for many of our listeners. So thank you for today, but also thank you for the work that you've done with the Emotional Capital report. I know with Judy Purse also, we're big fans of it at the Oxford Group, and have got some exciting plans, as you know, moving forward in the emotional intelligence space. So a big thank you for that as well, and all the best until we catch up again.
Thanks, Andy. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Thanks so much for listening to today's episode. We hope you took some insight or inspiration from the conversation. If you did, please hit the subscribe or like button. And that's not because we want to get loads of sponsors. It's just so we know that you're finding the content worthwhile and we can keep delivering more and more conversations. If you are finding it useful, why not follow us on LinkedIn or check out our website or sign up for our newsletter to keep up to date with upcoming events, insights and articles to help either yourself or the leaders in your organisation. Thanks again.